Welcome to Happy Planet, an impact economy podcast where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders in search of profit and planetary health. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. We live largely in a digital world, but some industries are still running on analog. Fisheries is one of them. While meat, poultry, and dairy are all fairly traceable, seafood is stubborn and slow to adopt new tech. Maybe at the origin, it's because of the sheer impracticality of working digitally on the water. Ironically, seafood is also one of the most controlled foods on the planet. It takes an immense amount of tagging, reporting, and paperwork to get products to consumers, especially oysters, which, as you know, I know something about. In my personal life, I am digital all the way to my Apple Watch, but due to a lack of digital tools, my oyster farm was completely analog. All of our reporting was handwritten. The harvest tags were handwritten, our state reports were handwritten, and our dealers worked largely the same way. They took the handwritten tags off our bags, tossed them in a box for safekeeping, and then they handwrote new tags before they shipped them off to the next dealer. Lost tags, illegible tags, approximate reporting to the state, and no digital backup was the norm. Until now. BlueTrace is changing all of that. You heard me talk about it with Nico in episode 2 as we were discussing big picture solutions for the seafood supply chain. BlueTrace is the only tagging, traceability, and compliance technology designed specifically for the shellfish industry. We will hear from founder and CEO Chip Terry, who recognized the ways this mobile technology can help fisheries big and small and the dealerships they sell to eliminate redundant data entry, streamline operations, and comply with regulations. Now, I have to provide full disclosure to our listeners today. I am a shareholder and a board member at BlueTrace. So maybe the best way to start this podcast today is to ask you, Chip, how are you going to make me rich?
Abigail, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I spent a lot of time sailing. It's a whole lot easier to go downwind than upwind. And the benefit of being in the shellfish world or in the seafood world is there's a lot of winds behind you. There is a growing demand for seafood. There's a growing demand for shellfish. There's a lot more farms out there. There's a lot of unmet need. That's the way you build a business, is you build it by finding things that people really need that they can't do themselves today.
We're talking about shellfish. We're talking about seafood. What is it that BlueTrace does?
At its core, we help seafood companies, particularly shellfish companies, comply with very complex regulations, provide a traceable path for their food, the chain of custody from the time it leaves the tide line to the time it arrives at your table. So that, first of all, you know it was handled safely. You're not going to get sick from this. 2, that it is what it says it is. So it's not been a relabeled product. And number 3, so you can actually meet the farmer. Meet Abigail Carroll and this amazing farm that she had in Scarborough, Maine, and understand why it was so cool and why it was interesting about it.
Very interesting. So you're not a 25-year-old entrepreneur.
So, yes, I am not.
I think we're the same age, so don't say it.
My wife makes fun of me. My wife's a doctor, and she's like, I've had the same job for a long time. And I'm like, I always switch jobs. I'm just very curious. Some would say a more negative connotation. I like the curious connotation. But I started out doing a PhD in American history thinking I was being a college professor. I started teaching for Princeton Review, the test prep company, and they opened a software office in Boston. And I was there for college and grad school. I came in to write questions. I mean, literally started in like, oh, we need some freelancer to write a few test questions. One thing led to another. And by the time I finished my PhD, I was the product manager for what at that point were CD-ROMs, launching GMAT, LSAT, SAT prep classes. And so I basically said, this is really fun. I get to build something and I get to put this really unique team together and launch something into the market and see it make a difference. And so I actually never applied for an academic job, and I sort of stuck in the tech industry. I was VP of strategy and marketing at Forrester Research. I was at a couple of different venture-backed companies, one of them Zoom Info, did quite well. And we were all about natural language processing and deep tech and teaching computers how to read. And so, the last one was BuzzAgent. We got acquired by a company called dunnhumby that then got acquired by Tesco, the big British retailer. And so I spent about 5 years managing a tech team, so about 50 engineers over in London, which was amazing for about 3 weeks, and then it sort of sucked after that. But anyway,
welcome to management.
In the process, I learned a lot of different things. I was having kids. And so it wasn't the time to start a new company, because when you start a new company, it's inherently risky. And so I waited until my kids were gone off to college. And then I'm like, okay, now I can start a company because I've got more time and less pressure on my schedule.
So you're in London, you have a PhD, and why seafood? How did you make that leap? Because this just seems like completely out of the box. I mean, having had an oyster farm, I know we needed some help, but how did you know that we needed that help?
I mean, it's a constellation of things. And it's like one of those classic ones where you connect the dots when you look back. First of all, I grew up on the coast of Maine. So I grew up down East Maine. For those of you who don't know it, up near Acadia National Park. And so I knew people who were in the fisheries. I knew people who were lobstermen, ground fishing. At one point, we lived next to what was at one point a shrimp plant that had then closed down. By the way, there are no shrimp harvested in Maine these days. My favorite foods were all seafood. So, that was sort of the background. Fast forward, while I was working for all these tech companies, we had a place up in Maine, and I would go, we call it harass the farmer day. I had some really good friends who had started oyster farms up here. So I'd take the family and the kids, and we'd hop in the boat and we'd drive over to the oyster farm and we'd buy oysters and we'd learn everything about it. We were some of the best days we ever had. And as I'm leaving Tesco, one of my friends who had an oyster farm said, "Hey, why don't you buy into my oyster farm and become a partner?" I never really thought about it, but I started looking at the industry and say, okay, let me understand more about this. For various reasons, I didn't buy into the farm, which was probably a really good decision. But in exploring it, I'm like, wow, this is an industry that is, first of all, taking off. Back to that, sail downwind, not upwind. Looking at the number of farms that was coming online. I mean, when I was growing up in Maine, there were maybe 5 farms in the whole coast of Maine. Now there's probably 250 and another 150 in permitting. And that's a global phenomenon. That's not just Maine. That's the Chesapeake. That's British Columbia. That's Ireland. That's the Gulf Coast of Mexico. That's the Baja Peninsula. You look at this and you're like, wow, there's a ton going on here. I mean, it'd be really neat to be involved. And then you begin to look at it further and say, I really want something that's great for our world. And one of the things that really appeals to me, having grown up in rural Maine, is, this has been a story of economic depression in rural Maine for generations. Basically, everybody I knew that was going to college went to college and never came back. And
they can't find jobs here.
Can't find jobs. The industries that are here are extractive or service, right? You're chopping down trees, or you're, servicing the summer people who come up for 3 months a year. That's pretty much it. And all of a sudden, you started to see some of these oyster farmers, in particular, college educated, coming back, starting these farms, putting their kids through college, buying houses on an industry that is actually great for the environment. And so to me, first of all, my first step into it was, I love the economic impact that this can have on these small rural communities. That matters a lot to me. But the next one is, all of these waterways have gotten a little bit polluted over time. And they were starting to clean up. The Clean Water Act was probably the first step there. But you have a bunch of different things going on. And now all of a sudden you can have an industry like shellfish farming that is actually great for the environment as well. And then finally, it produces a great food. We all love to eat it. I mean, if you look at the demand for oysters and mussels and clams, it continues to skyrocket. And it's also, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions profile of this, if you just move from chickens to oysters, you're reducing your greenhouse gas emissions by half.
Or more importantly, cocktail shrimp to oysters.
Yeah.
Because that's the real replacement, right? It's like the imported shrimp and the dead mangroves and everything that oysters are replacing. Yeah. That's huge. One of the things that's most interesting to me about your story and watching this business grow is that you came to the market with one idea, and then you made a really cold, brave pivot, a full pivot. You didn't just hedge the pivot and add a product. You came out batting for one thing. You realized there was a different problem to solve, and then you went out to solve it. So I want to hear about that.
Sure. I'm a historian by background. In history, you take all these data points and you begin to build a story. And you build a story that says, okay, I think this is my hypothesis of what actually happened and why people did what they did. Well, I actually looked at this in the seafood world, and I went around and I had this hypothesis that was sort of playing out, which is, geez, what farms need is they need a better way to manage their farm. They need a farm management system that allows them to understand how many products they're losing, what their yield rate is, what their team has been doing today, all the things that are going to make them more efficient. I still believe they need that. But what I missed in my hypothesis is they didn't really want that. Some farms did, but not everybody did.
Right. I want to get thinner, but I don't want to do a diet.
Exactly. So everybody says they want to eat organic, but when they get to the grocery store, they don't want to buy organic. And so we sort of started there, and we were sort of rolling a boulder up a hill. We'd gain 3 clients, we'd lose one. We'd gain 3 clients, we'd lose one, and we were up to 40 or 50 clients, but it was becoming more and more painful. But what we also did is I visited a ton of farms, and this is where the sort of understanding the market, understanding what's going on. I'd sit there and I'd watch people write out these tags by hand and write out logs. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? This looks painful. They're like, oh yeah, we just have to do this because of regulations. I said, well, maybe we could do this a little easier. What if we printed out these tags from your phone to a little thermal printer? So we started exploring that, and we launched that as sort of a side product, and it took off. Within 3 months, we had more people on that than we did on the other. And so then you face this decision of like, do you try to keep both products alive, or do you say, we've got a small team, let's try to move off of one and put all of our eggs in the other basket? As a small company, the biggest danger we have is we have a limited runway, we have a limited bandwidth. We better do one thing really well rather than trying to do 2 things mediocre. And so we made the decision about a year ago to just walk away from our farm management product. And what we did is we basically told all of our clients, we're not going to charge you anymore. We are going to retire this in about 8 months. And in the meantime, we invested everything in the tagging solution for shellfish farms, which then broadened out to a solution for distributors and beginning this sort of whole track up the chain. So it was amazingly hard. We still have some people who are unhappy with us because they love the product. But by and large, I think everybody understood it. And we were very cautious to explain, exactly why we were doing it and what we were doing.
Did your 50 initial clients follow you on the tagging product, or did some just
I think at this point,
angrily?
we probably have about 46 or 47 of them. There were a couple that sort of not stormed off, but said, oh, I don't know if we can trust you or whatnot. And so we had to build back trust, because that's probably the hardest thing. And that was probably the biggest question for us was we want to make sure that we treat our clients right, that we are, doing the right thing by them.
Right. So you've got these shellfish farmers, for example, on a boat, and they are printing out tags. And what is the mechanism that's making the whole traceability work? I mean, because it's a paper tag, right?
Yeah. So really a paper tag in our world is just a paper representation of a database record. So, there's a few things that have happened in this world that are really important in the tech world. One of which is cloud computing has come of age. Every one of our computers or our phones is now attached to the cloud. We can store a database record up in the cloud, which means you can access it from everywhere. It means it's not going to, disappear when you throw your phone overboard. So the other thing that's happened is QR codes have gotten super easy to deal with, and also what they call dynamic, so that they can do different things depending on who's scanning them.
So the tags have QR codes.
The tags have QR codes on them, and every one of our phones can scan that QR code and learn more about that product. So this is the database. So that's the link to the database record.
Very interesting.
And then the other thing that's actually really important, it seems really silly, is printers have gotten better. It seems like printers should have been a solved technology years ago, but it really hasn't, because we all hate our printers. We all hate the ink. But now they have these little thermal printers that are relatively inexpensive that print waterproof paper, and they print with heat instead of ink, so that the print never goes away unless you cook it. If you put it over 100 degrees, which, if you're doing that, you've got other problems. But being able to have these Tyvek-like tags that are printed out on a mobile printer on your boat make all the difference.
So tell me about the seafood industry you discovered, because I think it was probably a bit of a shocker to find out just how analog, to use a nice word, the industry really was.
Yeah. By definition, it's a mobile, rural, wet environment. So it's not well designed for, having even a laptop computer, much less a desktop computer. And so by default, almost everybody in this industry uses pencil and paper. Wet wax boxes with a crayon literally written on the side of the box. This is what it is. One of our clients is down in Philadelphia, and we went down there at 5 a.m. one morning to watch them unload a box of seafood. 14 tractor trailer loads of seafood coming in from all over the world. Every single box is literally a crayon on the side of it with handwritten paperwork that accompanies it explaining what's in here. We watched them unload like 2 pallets worth of squid. And somehow you're supposed to know that these cardboard boxes have 60 pounds of shrimp in each one. And the ones that have SQ are small squid, and the ones that have LQ are large squid. And then other than that, you know nothing about it. And so just watching what happens, you're like, my God, this is an industry that has done this for a reason, but it's got really opportunities. It's got some amazing opportunities to move forward.
So those squid boxes, tell me how your product, when you get to squid, how is this going to change that experience at the dealership?
At the very simple level, it's labeling and digital record keeping. So put a label that we actually tested a bunch of different adhesives. It turns out there's a lot of adhesives out there. And so we found the one
you know a lot about paper.
Oh my God. You could, it turns out there's like at least 35 regularly used adhesives in the world. And so we had to find the one that could stick to a wet wax box, but then when it froze, didn't fall off because a lot of seafood gets frozen, but we found that. So at the very simple level, it's put a label on the side of that box that has, information on what it is, when it was harvested, where it was harvested, and also has a link to that QR code so that now you have a database record that accompanies that, so that when that squid harvester packages those boxes, they put the label on the side. And in the process of putting that label on the side, they're also creating a digital record that can be passed to the buyer so that the buyer knows, oh, by the way, I've got 2 pallets of squid showing up. It was harvested in the Chesapeake on Monday. It's this size. This is the harvester. This is the certification. And by the way, it came from a sustainable fishery. It didn't come from some unsustainable fishery somewhere else in the world. That's the key to it.
It's kind of crazy. This is like a $200 billion industry in the United States alone. But how is it that there's so little transparency? I mean, it seems like we know where our beef comes from. We know where other products that we're eating on a regular basis comes from. Why is it that this industry is still so opaque? Is it just because it's so hard with the wet environment?
I mean, it's a bunch of things. It's a constellation. It's not one answer, but certainly the environment matters. But a big one also is this is an industry defined by a lot of small players. So just US and Canada, there's 96,000 producers and dealers in the seafood world. That is, 2,500 different lobstermen on the coast of Maine. That is, crabbers in Alaska. That is pollock fishermen out on the West Coast. It is, shrimp fishermen on the Gulf Coast. So there's just a ton of small players. And so first of all, that makes it really difficult. Other industries tend to be more consolidated. They tend to be very rural. Just by definition, you harvest in places that are not in urban centers. Until very recently, you had very bad internet connections. So having a digital connection from Newfoundland was tough. Now it's actually gotten a lot better. And so those are probably some of the reasons. And it's part of what's the joy of this industry too, which is it's not 5 big players. It's 9,600 different players just in the US. And that, by the way, we import 70% of our seafood. So if you expand that out, it's 300,000 plus, businesses in the global economy that are just importing to the US.
Potential clients. And that's how you're going to make me rich. I can see that.
And one of the challenges with any business like ours is you can target a few clients and sell them, a 6-figure or a 7-figure deal. Or you can target the vast majority of the companies and sell them a much smaller deal. And our whole strategy is focus on the small to mid-size market. Don't worry about the really big players yet. Focus on the start of that market where it's really difficult, but you have a solution that's fit for purpose.
So why do you think most clients who use your product are using it? What is the real benefit to them?
So the real benefit to them is productivity gains. It's how do I make it so it's faster for my guys on the front line to process the seafood? Seafood does not get better with age. And so, how do I make it so I can print out tags faster, create the logs faster, file my landing reports, tell my buyer what's coming to them? All the steps that you need to do for every single harvest that from your experience is just painful. And so it's all about productivity gains.
Yeah.
And then reducing error rates. The number of errors in your landing reports and your harvest logs, et cetera, is probably about 25%. So those are, those are the key things. We talk about traceability with investors, and it matters, and it's really important, but nobody buys us for traceability. What they buy us for is, how do I make my business better?
So right now you've got clients coming to you. You seems like you're not having to push sales. Sales are coming to you. How many clients do you have right now? And like, what's your universe looking like right now?
So we've got about 280 clients. It keeps going up every time I talk about it. So last month we added 23. A year ago we had less than 50.
Wow.
So we're closing a bunch of clients every week. We do certainly outreach sales. We reach out, but a lot of it's reactive sales. It comes through the network too. Friends telling friends, hey, by the way, you should use this. It makes it a lot easier. It's people's tags showing up at a distributor, and the distributor saying, oh, this will make my life easier. Let me use that. So it's the process of this network, and building this network is really critical.
I could definitely see how the network effect works. The dealer doesn't want multiple systems. They're using your QR code system, and they want to make sure everybody's on it. That must be a very powerful tool.
It is. About 60% of our sales come through the network today.
After a short break, we'll dive into Chip's advice for entrepreneurs, his experience with venture capital, and how his technology will ease the transition as major changes come down the pike from the FDA. For a blue economy to thrive, people need to use more sustainable products. But which products? And will consumers actually adopt them? Innovators like you are hustling to figure this out. Spark number 9 can tell you if there's demand for your product. Spark markets your product before it's built, using online advertising so you launch smarter. Have a big idea? Vet it with Spark before you build. Visit Spark online at www.sparkno9.com or find them on LinkedIn. Maine Venture Fund is a state-sponsored venture fund here in Maine with a mission to support the highest potential Maine-based startup companies by investing early-stage capital. Maine Venture Fund's goal is to accelerate job growth and economic opportunity for the people of Maine. Learn more at mainventurefund.com. Welcome back to Happy Planet.
I just want to get back to something you talked about earlier. Had I known this about you, I would have put a lot more money in this business. You were a small boat sailor. You race lasers all year round. I feel like this small boat racing is just like a wonderful metaphor for startups. You're navigating this precarious vessel that's very capsizable, not unlike a startup, in this dynamic environment with swells and wind, and you have to stay the course and adapt it. Do you think that your laser sailing has had an impact on your career, which seems to have been very nimble with navigating and strategic pivots?
That is my great joy in life in many ways, is racing boats. I love going out, and I do it, as you said, all year round. I race a lot in Marblehead these days. Not to brag, but I've won 3 of the last 4 championships there against a lot of kids who are in college. So, and I'm not in college. I'm a long ways from that. To me, there's a few things that really matter. One of which is just the incremental improvement. It's both in startups and in sailboat racing. It's all about getting 5% better every time you do a start. Because if you can keep improving just a little bit every time you do something, you're going to be a whole lot better by the end of the season. Number 2 is, as you said, being nimble. One of the things that happens on a lot of race courses, people get locked in. They're like, I'm going to go over this side. I'm going to be locked in over here. And 80% of the time, that was exactly the right call. But you got to be aware that other 20% of the time, it's not going to be. There's going to be the black swan event that comes through, and you need to get out of there. And then the third one that I think really matters in this world is it's all about sensory perception. It's getting your head out of the boat, looking at where the wind's coming from, where the current's coming from, where the fleet is, where the waves are, all the pieces that are going to make a difference. And it's the same metaphor in a startup. Where are the regulatory environment changing? What's changing in these people's businesses? Is there big acquirers coming into this world? Is there something new that's changing? Is the demand increasing or decreasing? And so there's a lot of different things that are going on in this world that matter. Keeping your eyes out of the boat is the thing I tell every sailor. It's like, get good enough so you keep your eyes out of the boat and look at what's coming down the line. The same thing applies in business. Get your eyes out of your business so you can see what else is going on. One of the reasons I love this business is I spend a lot of time going to just random rural locations to meet seafood people. And sometimes I learn something, sometimes I learn nothing. But like I just spent yesterday, at one of the largest clam dealers in Maine. who supplies most of the grocery stores in Massachusetts. Just watching what they're doing and seeing how they're packaging stuff and how they're using our system and what are the little improvements we could make. That's really critical.
You seem to have the wind at your sails. The FDA is doing some changes. How's that going to affect you?
Again, sail downwind. The regulations are, for a lot of obvious reasons, getting stronger. There's this thing called the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was passed by Congress about 10 years ago. In that Food Safety Modernization Act, they mandated sort of digital traceability for high-risk foods, which, by the way, includes pretty much all seafood except scallops and catfish. And what that mandate says is you as a seafood producer or distributor must be able to give the FDA digital records of all your transactions within 24 hours, which for big companies is fine. They can do that. For small companies, they really struggle with that. And so these regulations are coming for food safety reasons, for illegal fishing reasons, for unregulated fishing reasons, all the reasons that we know out there. The FDA actually tried to stop doing this. They tried to say, this is going to be too much of a burden on the industry. And they got sued, and they're now under court order to have it out by November this year.
How's that going to affect your business?
Well, I think it'll be, in some ways, I hate to say it, but it's going to be positive for our business, because if I had to guess, 90% of the seafood world would have trouble complying with that regulation today. The other one that's related to it is NOAA, who manage all fisheries in the US and also all seafood imports, has put together what they call the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP. And it used to cover just high-risk species like tuna, but they've expanded it now to cover pretty much all seafood that's imported to the US. And it's effectively the same regulations for all imports. You've got two sets of regulations that are impacting the seafood industry.
So if you just price it right, you can just get all the clients you need.
That's the goal. Obviously, it'll be different than that, but you got to make sure that you've got the right product. One of the things that's really important to me is making something that's scalable. It's pretty easy to solve one person's problem. It's harder to solve three people's problems, and it's a lot harder to solve 100 people's problems with one product. And so, how do you build something that can really scale out?
And when you're dealing with foreign companies that are exporting their goods to the United States, are there different laws and protocols that you have to put in place? Does the product have to adapt?
It does. And so we built this engine underneath our product that basically says, if you're in shrimp and you're importing to the US, these are the regulations you have to follow. These are the fields you have to follow. If you're oysters on the coast of Maine or your mussels in Newfoundland, here are the different pieces you have to do.
It sounds like everything's just going in your favor. Any headwinds at all?
I mean, there's always headwinds. There's always things that you need to pay attention to. One of them has been supply chain stuff. Finding printers and paper has been more difficult than it ever should have been. We've had periods where we just couldn't get printers and paper, and we've had to work a lot to figure that out. One of the things we haven't talked about is team. The number one reason that companies fail or succeed is the team. And so we're really fortunate that because I've had a lot of different jobs, I was able to hire people that I generally worked with in the past who I really trust and I know are really good at their jobs. But continuing to expand that team as we grow is a difficult challenge. Finding people who have seafood networks, that have some digital aptitude, that can really work in this world is always a challenge. Then there is the world of this industry, which is, this is an old industry. This is an industry where many of these companies are third, fourth generation ownership. They've been doing it the same way since granddad did it. And I don't want to change. And so just overcoming that fear of change.
I can see that. But you're not encountering the sort of Seaspiracy situation, right? Did you see the movie Seaspiracy?
I did. So I like to think that we're actually helping the few things that they got right in that movie. A lot of that stuff was great for producing a movie that you wanted to see people to see, but maybe it was not entirely accurate or nuanced in the way it should have been. But one of the things they point out, which is rightly, is some fisheries are really well managed and some are not. And squid, to come back to my squid example, there's squid all over the world. There are 4 fisheries worldwide, at least 2 of them in North America and a couple in Australia and I think Europe, that are really well managed. They're sustainably managed, that you should eat that squid. It's going to be a sustainable product over time. The rest of them are not. Well, how do you know which squid you got? How do you know you got the squid from that sustainably managed fishery in the Chesapeake and not from a Chinese fishery where it's totally overfished, or a Russian fishery.
Yeah. And that seems to be on trend with so many things. Now we want to buy fashion. We want to know who sewed it. We want to know that they were paid properly. It's not for the sake of the chain itself. It's for the sake of knowing our own footprint, our own impact on the world as we consume and purchase things. So you're out in the market right now looking for cash. What's that like? I've heard the VC market's falling apart. Is that true?
We only see part of the elephant, so we don't know what the entire VC market is like. For us, it's actually been pretty positive. We've seen the market do quite well. The VC market is a weird place. I've been involved in a bunch of different startups where we've raised money. And you got to do a few things. You got to convince people that there's a big enough addressable market. Well, there's a big addressable market. There's a lot of seafood producers. It's 17% of the protein we eat. It's growing faster than the rest of the protein. The fastest growing protein source in the world is aquaculture. So there's a lot of things that say, this is a big market with the right tailwinds. Number two, you have to convince them that you got the right team, because you're going to have pivots. You're going to have things that change. That's really critical. And so we have that. And then you've got to show what they call product market fit. Does your product meet the market needs? Do you have new clients coming on? Do you have renewal rates at the right place? Do you have pricing at the right place? Or can you at least get there? And I think we have that. We keep showing that with our tagging and traceability. Those are sort of the key things you need to be able to show any investor. And then there's a lot of due diligence beyond that. One of the things we just found out is we just got approved for a patent, our very first patent.
Great.
It's on systems and methods for tracing seafood. You put basically claims into a patent. We got all 20 claims approved on the first go, which is really unusual, apparently. So we apparently should have had like 40 claims.
Wow.
And we've got another one that hopefully will be following along shortly behind.
That's amazing. Chip, do you see any trends in the industry with respect to sort of aquaculture and wild catch, or other trends that are kind of interesting that you may not have expected to see?
The first one that's fascinating is 50% of our seafood today comes from aquaculture, and that continues to rise. So whether it's salmon farming, shrimp farming, oyster farming, clam farming, it's, by and large, a lot going on there. So that's a really well-known trend. The one that surprised me was wild fisheries. Like, I think of that aquaculture side as, it's just taking off and eventually it's going to replace all wild fisheries. And in some categories, that's true. In some categories, like shellfish, that's probably the right trajectory. But in other categories, they've actually gotten really good at managing fisheries. Interesting. The scallop industry in New Bedford is a great example. In the 1980s, the scallop industry was dying in New Bedford. You could buy a boat for nothing. They'd literally give them away. And NOAA, some local researchers at universities in the area, and the fishermen all got together and said, what can we do about this? And they started this whole program where they were actually like taking cameras out, all the scallop beds, the known scallop beds, and tracking how many scallops they actually have on the bottom and what sizes they are and what stages of their life cycle are they at. And then they're able to figure out, okay, so these ones are breeding populations, never touch those. These ones have, 2 years ago, they were small, but now they've reached market size. They've already bred the next generation. These are perfect ones to harvest. And, then they figured out a rotational scheme so they can open up different areas, different places. They set in place a quota system. So there's only a certain amount that can be harvested each year based on the surveys that they do each year. They tax every fisherman out there to say, 10% or whatever the number is of your catch, you have to pay it back so we can have these scientists go out and make sure that the fishery is sustainable. And the net result of it is the scallop fishery in, off the Massachusetts coast is probably healthier than it's ever been.
That's amazing.
And people are employed. You now, if you want to buy a boat and buy quota to go along with it, you're talking $3 to $4 million. Like, this is a big number. And so you have fisheries like that. Salmon fishery out in Alaska is very similar. Crab fishery out in Alaska is very similar. Yet a lot of the European fisheries are really well managed. I mean, there are examples that are not. Cod fishing in the Gulf of Maine is an example. Totally overfished, collapsed. It may never come back, which is scary. Whereas the cod fisheries in Norway and particularly Iceland were well managed at the same time. So pretty much all the cod we get today comes from well managed fisheries in Iceland.
And are your clients talking about climate change, like your harvester clients?
Yes. So we hear a couple of different things. So one of which is particularly the hatcheries. One of the things that happens with climate change and warming waters is the ocean chemistry changes. It gets more acidic, and that makes it harder for particularly juvenile shellfish to produce shell, which means that, you can have whole hatcheries that collapse. And Mook Seafood in Maine is a really good example of figuring that out. Yeah. Another one that's happening is water's warm, different pathogens come in. And you're more likely to have things like Vibrio. Vibrio is the number one disease for shellfish. It's the reason that people get sick. And it used to be you'd never see that in Maine. Now there's regular closures in Maine because of Vibrio. Yeah. A lot of the regulations are designed to reduce this Vibrio problem.
Your product is going to help with that too, because if there's a Vibrio problem in a certain group of shellfish, you'll be able to spot that very quickly, right?
Yeah, by having a digital traceability chain, you can then, figure out, there's a problem here. There's a recall of this particular oyster. Let's figure out where else they are. And then, the other thing is it's time and temperature management. The number one way to manage particularly Vibrio is keeping it cold. And so, what our system does is maintains the cold chain. It records whether it was well managed in the cold chain or not. Did what should have been a 2-hour drive in a truck turn into a 10-hour drive, or maybe the guy stopped overnight and turned the truck off and then turned it back on in the morning? That's something you should know about before you buy those oysters.
Yeah, for sure. Last question. When you exit and you become a cajillionaire and you make me a multimillionaire, are you going to buy a bigger boat?
No, I like the small boats. The bigger the boat, the more it sits on the mooring. I want
true.
Small boats that I can go out. I want small boats that I can go out all the time.
All right.
Thank you, Chip, for coming on the program. I am delighted to share that since we recorded this podcast, the Food Safety Modernization Act did pass, and Chip is just closing his fundraising round now. This will enable the company to ramp up and meet the upcoming demand. Digital traceability will help keep food fresher, and in the case of a problem, we can get to the source faster. It will also lift the operational burden of managing handwritten forms for businesses, while also increasing the transparency of provenance for the buyers and consumers. It's 6 p.m. Do you know where your fish came from? Happy Planet Podcast was reported and hosted by Abigail Carroll. I'm also the executive producer. The talented Dylan Hoyer is our producer and editor, and composer George Brandel Egloff created our theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetcapital.com.